Hello again. This is the introduction to part two of the course. By this point in time, you've already submitted your first midterm, I'm assuming. You could theoretically be watching this before having done your first midterm, and that would be fine too. But in terms of the progression of the course, this video or talk again is intended to introduce you to get ready for part two. Part two is, in some ways, the real core of the course. Um, this is the longest part. It has 5 weeks, from weeks 5 to 10, on the normal progression. Um, and some of the lectures are longer than other times, because this is actually, on one level, this is going chronologically to the period of my own expertise. And as I talked about in the introduction to the course, as a professor, I feel it is my responsibility to share with you what I uniquely can. And so the lectures focus more on my own areas of expertise and knowledge. But this really sets the foundation for an interconnected world. We'll be talking more about in part three. This is a period of time that the textbook refers to as the emergence of European hegemony, which I address in some of the lectures. And that is, there's an element to that is actually accurate. I mean, we'll see this in this part of the course, but also in parts 3 and 4 as well. What we're talking about here is the 16th through the 18th century. Now, certainly the lectures begin actually with Rome, and so if not even going back to Greece. So that's certainly not the time of European hegemony, but beginning in the 16th century, which I think week 8 or so or 9 covers. Um, we have a time when what used to be treated in history courses under the theme or the title of European expansion. Now, that is a very Eurocentric perspective. And as I believe I mentioned even in one of the lectures that even as an undergraduate, when I was an undergraduate, that was an old way of doing it. And the course I had was called Europe, Africa, and Asia, because it's looking at Europe in the broader perspective of the world. And so, for so many years, for the first 1,000 years or more or so of its history, um, what we today refer to as Europe was really uh, not part of the rest of the world. I mean, there were interactions on the borders in terms of trade. I'll address some of those things. But it's really only in the 16th century, and then as I'll be talking about in part three to begin with, the Age of Discovery, so to speak, again from a European perspective, that we find an interconnectedness to the point where one scholar, Emanuel Wallerstein, talks about the emergence of the world system. Now, that I'll be talking about in the lectures. Or I should say the lectures. We'll be talking about that for part three. But here in part two, that kind of sets the foundation for that emergence of a world economy. We can call it a world system, but really seeing the interconnections whereby we can no longer simply look at the development of a given territory in and of itself. And we see similar things with China, with India, and then, of course, with the Americas, because this is a period when uh, Europeans first came to what was in their mind the New World, which obviously to the Native Americans who were here prior to Europeans stumbling upon the continent of North and South America, um, it was not new. It was not a new world. It was their world. And this is gets at a conflict of perspective, and therefore, too, of interpretation. And I do address this in some of the lectures. But if you think about it, we all view the world that we experience from a given point of observation, from our own experience, our own understanding and knowledge, from our own context. And we try to relate that to people who have a very different point of departure, a very different perspective, a very different culture. Um, we hear so much about diversity today, and that's all very good, and I support diversity. But what we're really getting at is how do we achieve a diverse understanding? Because we are all coming at our understanding of the world from a very local, particular perspective. And so this part of the course tries to set the foundation for realizing how do we deal with the emerging conflict of perspectives. This is Perspectives on World History, is the official name of this course. And when we are seeing developments, if we were in China, if we were raised and if you're Chinese and grew up in China, we have a very different perspective on how the whole world system emerged than if we were European or in within America. We have a very different perspective from the Europeans. And we can go further and say, if we're on the East Coast of America, we have a very different perspective than the West Coast. And having grown up on the West Coast, I can say that's absolutely the case. And so, how do we handle that? And if there are conflicts, and I'm not here talking about, physical conflicts necessarily, even though certainly it could lead to that, and as world history has shown us, that did lead to that. But simply conflicts of perspectives and worldviews. That's also something I refer to as ideology. I talk about that in the lectures. And ideology, which I say is simply we all are ideological. We all have our own ideology. And by that, I'm not talking about a particular philosophy. I'm talking about the assumptions we make about how the world works. So we're going to be looking in the lectures at the quote-unquote European ideology. How did it emerge? From what did it emerge? And if we try to then compare that with the Chinese, the Indian, the African, the North American, South American perspectives, how does it all fit together to come to an understanding of quote unquote the whole? Because if we're dealing with world history, we're dealing with all of the world. That's the whole. Is that even possible? And this gets at the problems and the challenges of world history and some of the issues that I addressed in the first part of the course in terms of the lectures. What does doing history really mean, and how do we go about doing it? And this is not an issue of saying, the Europeans were right, or the Europeans were wrong, or the Chinese were right, or the Chinese were wrong, the Native Americans were right, the Native Americans were wrong. That's not what this course is trying to get at, but to try to understand the dynamics that led to the conflicts. Were there conflicts? Of course there were conflicts. But, I grew up still at a time when Thanksgiving was celebrated as, the arrival of, the Europeans and the pilgrims coming to America and then meeting the Indians at the time, which were still called Indians at the time, which is from Columbus, because Columbus's mistake. He didn't, he referred to them as Indians because he thought he was in India. But I talk about that in the lectures too, I believe. And sitting down and smoking the peace pipe and sharing a meal together, a Thanksgiving meal. Isn't this wonderful? That's one perspective. Another perspective is Thanksgiving commemorates the brutal invasion and suppression of an indigenous population by Europeans. That's a very different narrative, a very different grand narrative of what was going on. And every culture has their own grand narratives. Every individual, in some ways, we could even come back to that level, has their own grand narrative. How do we put it all together? And those grand narratives are based on ideologies, which are, again, I say, structures of thought that we just assume is the way the world works. Now, they can be challenged, they can run into conflicts themselves, and that was some of the things that we'll see they'll talk about in the lectures here, but for this part of the course, but also then for part 3 and part 4, where they're challenged. And in this part of the course, when they just all of a sudden seem not to be working anymore. What do we do when what we always assumed was the way the world works isn't the way the world is working? How do we handle that? And what comes about out of that crisis, as I refer to it in the lectures. Now, that's the larger picture of it in terms of part two, what part two gets at it. If we look at the essay question for part two, for exam two, I think that's a good place to start in terms of how are you going to approach part two? How are you going to sift through all the information? Because there's a lot, and chronologically, it goes, if you want to go from Rome from the emergence of the Roman Empire, depending on how that's defined, and I'll define that for you in the lectures, to the middle of the 16th century. We're talking, over 1,000 years of history, 1,500 years of history. How do you get a handle on that and grasp it? And that's just with respect to Europe, or what became Europe, because Rome was more or less a world culture too, a world empire, and that, as I refer to it as a myth of Rome, that idea of world empire and domination, has remained in the West in many ways still to today. And that is what is kind of behind the textbook's reference about European hegemony as an ideological position. You can say, oh, it's a biased position. Yes, it is. So they address this too in the lectures. Bias is simply the view from a particular point of observation, where everyone's biased. We think of it being as, oh, horrible, you're biased. Everyone is biased because everyone has their own point of observation. And things look differently if we change our point of observation. In some ways, that's what this course is about. Offering different perspectives, that is, different points of observation on the development of human cultures and civilizations in the world as such. Now, you look at the essay question, and then also, as I talked about for the first part of the course and the first exam, the list of terms. You should use those to help sift through the information that you find in the lectures and in the textbook. I just want to read right now, and I hope this won't cut things off. But anyway, if it does, I'm technologically challenged, just to let you know. Of course, if you haven't figured that out already. And sometimes when I go to a file, I end up stopping the video. I hope that won't be the case this time. But I just want to read for you the exam question, of course, which you can read and have read, and it's been available to you since the first day of class again. But here's the essay that you will be having to write at the end of part two of the course, at the end of week 10. What was the role of myth in the emergence and development of Christendom? How did Christendom then become transformed into early modern Europe? How does the development of Christendom from Circa, or approximately 400, to approximately 1560, compare with developments of Buddhism and Islam? To what extent can we understand world history during this period as an increasing conflict of myths/religions? Now, that is, again, as all the essay questions, a pretty wazoo question that's impossible to answer. There's no right answer. There's no wrong answer, as I said previously with respect to the first exam. There are good answers and bad answers. Now, one of the difficult things to grasp, especially for us here in the West, so to speak, is that for the development of the Middle Ages in Europe, as I'll be talking about it, religion and politics were one and the same thing. We have this concept, this idea, this myth of the separation, quote unquote, of church and state. I'm not going to go into that. I talk about it somewhat in the lectures, because what it actually is the non-establishment clause, that the government is not allowed constitutionally to establish a state religion. And yet, ask yourselves this: even if there is something that we can describe as the separation of church and state in the United States, is there a separation of religion and politics? Should there be a separation of religion and politics? Why or why not? What's behind that? We've become such a secularized society in some ways, but there are significant numbers of people in our society, in the United States and Europe, throughout the world, who have become, let's say, less and less religious. Does that mean that religion is no longer a factor? Well, if you follow American politics, I don't see how you could even pretend to proclaim that religion is not a factor in politics. But it's the same way in other parts of the world as well. Religion is part of the ideology of how we view the world. Then you may say, oh, yeah, but I'm not religious anymore. I've grown up, so to speak. I've gotten beyond religion. I'm an atheist. Well, see, fine, you're an atheist. That's a religion too. This is a different one. It is an atheistic religion, a religion without God, not being religious. What is being religious? We talk about this in the lectures, a bit in the first lectures. Being religious and what a religion is worship. But worship of what? Was it obviously of God or gods or whatever? But it can also be worship of something that you set up as a god. Oh, you say, well, that's idolatry. Idolatry. Yes, it is. That's one of the definitions of idolatry. And yet we do that. Is money a god? Is power a god? Is domination a god? Is sex a god? All these things that we, quote unquote, worship, which is basically just to cultivate and make what one philosopher called Hans Georg Gadamer, the issue of care. What do we care most about? Because that which we care most about becomes our God, essentially. Not the God of the Christian scriptures or even of the Hebrew Bible, not the God of, a fundamentalist understanding of that, certainly, or a philosophical position of God, but it's almost a socio-cultural understanding of that which we give the greatest value to becomes a God for us. Those are conflicts. How do we handle them? What do we see? And that concept of God, not in a theistic sense, but in the concept or the context of that which we care most about, which maybe is ourselves. Maybe we set ourselves up as a God. Whatever is that care, that affects and determines all that we do, all that we believe, all that we think, and how we interact with other people as individuals and as civilizations and countries and nations and states and the world as such. So that's what that question is getting at. Because it is during this chronological period, too, of between 400 CE and 1560 CE, that we see in different parts of the world the rise and spread not only of Christianity, but of Buddhism and Islam, too. Let's say the three great world religions: Christianity, Buddhism, and Islam are all arising kind of more or less at the same time and spreading more or less at the same time. What effect did that have? What's the relationship between religion and politics in China, in India, in Saudi Arabia, what we call today Saudi Arabia, the Middle East, Arabia at the time? How does that all work together? That's what this is getting at. Now, the term myth in that question I discussed too in the lectures and define it for you. Myth so often is used in distinction to what's true. Myth is, oh, that's just a myth. That's not true at all. It's just a myth. That's not how I use the term myth here. How I use the term myth here is that there is something that I've labeled mythopoetical truth. What is the truth of poetry? It's not literally true. It's not scientifically true, but it gets at a truth that can't be expressed in a different way. In some ways, love is a myth. Because what is love? We can say, well, it's a evolutionary biological adaptation of the inherent instinct to procreate and reproduce ourselves as a species. Well, if you really want to kill the mood, so to speak, start thinking of it in those ways. Why am I doing this? Because this is an evolutionary process by which I'm supposed to reproduce. Ew. Do you see what I'm getting at? That's what I'm trying to get at. What is that thing that it is? Do we reduce it to the material? Do we reduce it to the biological? Do we reduce it? Biological is material. There is that level of something out there. It's the level of myth, of belief, of truth. What is justice? Find me justice. Show me what justice is. It's a belief. It's a myth. But it's a myth that is true. What are you willing to die for? Are you willing to die for an idea? That's a good question. What is democracy? Is it an idea that you're willing to die for? Freedom. What is freedom? Are there limits to freedom? What do we do about it? All these ideals that are out there that seem so wonderful, when we start to analyze them, what are they really getting at? That is what I refer to as mythopoetic truth. Now, it doesn't mean that all ideals are true mythopoetically. It doesn't mean that all mythopoetic truths are good or helpful. But it's looking at the phenomena by which it's formed. How are these ideals, these myths formed, and what impact do they have? That's what this question is getting at. Myths and beliefs. If you believe a myth, you don't see it as a myth. You say, that's just true. That's the way it is. It's true. If you all of a sudden say, yes, I have a belief in the truth, you have a mythology, an ideology. That is, not correct. We all have our myths, our ideologies, our beliefs. It's impossible not to. We cannot dismiss belief, even if we dismiss Christianity or whatever religion that we had some sort of relationship to, if we ever did, or atheism. Let's say we can dismiss atheism as a belief system in a religion, which it is. We can't get away from it. We're just replacing one with the other. Belief is the basis of all that humans do. I would not be saying what I'm saying right now if I did not have a hope or a belief that this might help you for the exam, number one, and number two, that I think it's important for you to hear and listen to and think about. Beliefs. Do you get up in the morning? Well, if you didn't believe that you could, you wouldn't. If you're lying in bed, so I can't, and I don't really mean that feeling of I can't get up, I don't want to get up, you all have that, but really like, I don't believe I can get myself out of bed. Maybe that too is telling of my age. But analogously, think of another example, the things we just do, but it's based on a belief. We don't always make that connection of, I want to go to a movie. What's that based on? Beliefs. It's belief that I actually have the capacity to do that, the means to do that, the opportunity to do that, and that there's a movie I want to see, and I know where it is, and I know how to get there. Those are all based on beliefs. Knowledge, the foundation of it, is belief. That's even one of the definitions of knowledge. It's justified belief. So there are reasons for believing X. If we don't believe X, we won't do X. There may be, we might be able to anyway, but maybe we all really can fly. We just haven't figured it out yet. But I don't believe that I can fly. On one level, I hope none of you believe that you can fly. Literally fly by flapping your arms or whatever. But if someone did believe they could fly, could they really do it? But if someone does not believe they can fly, they're not going to try. I don't go out there and try to flap my arms or imagine myself flying when I have to go to shopping at Needler's. I get in my car and I drive because I know I can't fly. But let's say I somehow had the capacity to fly. I just haven't found that yet. If I believed it, I might try to find it. If I believed that I could, even theoretically, I might actually try. I might go out there and flap my arms. Belief is the basis of all human actions. Therefore, this question is getting at, let's look at the belief systems that we refer to as religions and the great religions. And I don't mean that in a qualitative sense. I don't think there's anything, as a historian, I should say, qualitatively greater about Christianity, Islam, or Buddhism than there is about Judaism or Sikhism or Hinduism or any number of the Native American religions or any number of the African religions. But in terms of just sheer numbers, there are, Christianity, Islam, and Buddhism represent the largest numbers of believers. So therefore, that's why I point to these three religions. And that's why the question is asking about these three great religions, world religions, that you'll find almost everywhere. Where did they arise? In what context did they arise? Are there similarities in the emergence and development in that political sense of where these religion and politics complex? It always goes together. Religion and politics have always been together. How does that affect, how does the belief structure affect the development of the political development, if that makes any sense? That's what this is getting at on the upper level of the point of part 2, is setting the stage for the interactions and at times conflicts of belief systems or ideologies within the world context. And since the European Christian tradition is what I study and is what I know, that's what the lectures are focusing on. And therefore, too, because that's part of the course material, I will expect you to know more about that in some ways than about the other, than Islam or Buddhism that are covered in the textbook. And I refer to them both, especially with Islam, because there was a very close connection between Christianity and Islam. Also politically in the Middle Ages, something known as the Crusades, which you probably have heard of. And so keep in mind that the examination will be based on the course material. But I, again, wanted to present to you what I can. It's just touching the surface. I teach, I think I said this in one of the lectures, I teach a course in the early Middle Ages. I teach a course in the High Middle Ages. I teach a course in the Renaissance. I teach a course in the Reformation. So it's like 4 courses, 4 full semester courses, trying to hit the highlights in 5 weeks. So there's a lot more behind even all that I present in lectures. Now, I hope that gives you perspective on what the second part of the course is about before we then get to the third and fourth parts of the course, putting it all together, so to speak, and asking the question, what difference does it make? If you have questions, as always, please just ask, reach out. Email me if along the way, if you're reading one of my lectures and you think, I don't see that, that's not what I was been taught, or that's not how I view it, I disagree, send me an email. Let's talk about it. Let's have a chat about the material over Zoom. This is not simply me saying this is the truth that I want you to memorize and learn so you can repeat it on an exam. That is not how I go about teaching. That's not what I view my role is. That's not what how I view what the purpose of this class is in my view. I have a perspective. The textbook has a perspective. You have a perspective. It's all trying to fuse and mesh and come up with new perspectives as we're confronted with new information and the perspectives of quote unquote, the other, that which we are not, which is the only way we have of then reflecting on how do we view the world? How do we view ourselves within the world? That's the importance of world history. This sets the core stage for it in part 2. Enjoy. I hope to hear from you. I'll be participating in the discussions again off and on. And I'll be looking forward to reading your second exam when you get there. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.